On July 12, 1943, the quiet of the Texas prairie was abruptly broken. The train shrieked violently, its massive iron wheels grinding relentlessly against the searing hot rails, sending brilliant sparks momentarily flashing into the unforgiving noon light. Fine dust, kicked up from the vast, dry landscape, swirled incessantly, coating the sweating faces and uniforms of the German soldiers crammed tightly within the suffocating confines of the boxcars. They had been told their destination was a place of deep humiliation, severe punishment, perhaps even slow starvation. Whispers had circulated that America would treat them as mere chattel, beasts utterly devoid of dignity. Yet, as the air brakes hissed and the cars jolted to a complete stop, what first greeted their anxious eyes was not the stark, cold geometry of concrete walls, nor the ominous, towering silhouettes of machine gun nests. Instead, they saw a solitary man. He leaned against a weathered fence post, one worn boot casually hooked on the lowest rail. A wide-brimmed Stetson hat shaded his eyes, while a subtle glint of metal spurs caught the merciless glare of the sun. The German prisoners, pressing tightly against the barred windows, squinted through layers of grime and utter disbelief. One soldier mumbled a single word, suspended somewhere between genuine awe and cynical mockery: "Cowboy." He had seen such figures before, but only in fleeting American films smuggled into Germany during the years before the war. For most of these men, Hollywood was a realm of pure fantasy, a world as utterly unreal as the fairy tales of their childhood. Yet, here he stood, in flesh and dust, framed by an endless, mocking sky that seemed to underscore their profound confinement. As the heavy train doors clanged open, a wave of air rushed in, thick with the pungent aromas of sagebrush, cattle, and rich manure. This was not the acrid stench of war, but the earthy, undeniable odor of life itself, resilient and unbroken. The prisoners stumbled out, blinking against the blinding light, their movements constrained not by chains, but by sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. Their heavy boots sank into the loose, yielding soil, a stark contrast to the hard cobblestones of Bremen, Hamburg, or Berlin. They braced themselves for jeers, for rifles brutally thrust into their ribs, for snarling, guttural commands. Instead, the guards, most of them local farmers reluctantly drafted into service, simply observed them with a quiet, almost dispassionate patience. And there, interspersed among them, stood more men adorned in wide-brimmed hats and rugged leather boots. These were Americans who appeared less like soldiers of a vast industrial empire and more like authentic characters plucked directly from the pages of a dime novel. One comrade later recounted in his diary, "I thought we had been transported into a moving picture. There were horses grazing peacefully beyond the fence, and the men who guarded us carried themselves not as tormentors, but as ranchers vigilantly watching their herd. Only we were the herd now." The irony of the situation was sharply felt. These were men who had fiercely fought in Rommel's storied Africa Corps, who had stood resolute in the shifting sands of Tunisia, who had firmly believed in the powerful myth of German superiority. Yet here, stripped bare of their rifles and their pride, they were confronted by Americans whose weapons were not merely carbines, but an entire distinct way of life. Relaxed, confident, seemingly forged by the boundless expanse of wide-open spaces. To the Germans, accustomed to rigid hierarchy and bellowed orders, the Cowboys' loose, easy stance and profound silence conveyed a different, unsettling kind of authority. A sergeant barked for them to form ranks, but even as they mechanically obeyed, many found their gaze irresistibly drawn to the vast horizon. There were no looming concrete walls, no endless tangles of barbed wire stretching into infinity. Just the rolling prairie, the gentle ripple of grass under the wind, and the faint, distant shadow of grazing cattle. A strange unease settled over them. This was captivity, yes, but it was also a glimpse of a freedom utterly unfamiliar to men who had lived their entire adult lives under the iron discipline of the Reich. As they were marched toward the camp, they finally saw the barbed wire fence. It seemed simple, almost fragile, compared to the formidable barriers they had anticipated. Wooden guard towers stood sentinel, but for the moment, they were unmanned, their ladders empty. Guards strolled rather than marched, some even offering a casual tip of their hats to the local residents who had gathered to watch the spectacle. Children perched precariously on fence rails, their young faces alight with curiosity to see the so-called enemy. Women in sunbonnets stood in the oppressive heat, whispering as they observed young German men, no older than their own sons, serving overseas. It was a tableau rich with contradictions. Enemies met with the curious gaze of neighbors, conquerors transformed into public spectacles. Inside the camp, the layout sprawled more like a working ranch than a traditional prison. Long, orderly rows of wooden barracks stood neatly arranged, with a central mess hall, and beyond them, wide-open fields where the prisoners would soon be put to work. The first true shock came when the enticing smell of food wafted toward them. Savory beef stew simmering gently, the rich, bitter aroma of fresh coffee brewing. For many, this sensation was a cruelty in itself. They had been explicitly told that America would starve them. Instead, the unmistakable scent of abundance permeated the air. One soldier whispered bitterly, "My mother has not tasted beef in 3 years." The enigmatic cowboy, who had initially captured their attention, still leaned near the fence, seemingly amused by their profound disbelief. He chewed thoughtfully on a blade of grass, spat nonchalantly into the dirt, and offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod as the column passed. That simple gesture struck deeper than any shouted insult. It was not triumphalism, but rather a profound indifference, the mark of a man utterly secure in his own place, completely unthreatened by their former power or might. The Germans were herded into their barracks. But even inside, conversation buzzed animatedly about everything they had just witnessed. Some insisted it was an elaborate trick, a cunning piece of propaganda designed to soften them before the true cruelty inevitably arrived. Others whispered excitedly of opportunity, of work, food, perhaps even a chance at regaining some dignity. One young officer, barely 22, sat on his bunk and muttered, "If this is captivity, it is entirely different from any captivity I ever imagined." Outside, the familiar sounds of ranch life drifted through the camp. A dog barking in the distance, a horse neighing, the lowing of cattle. The prisoners lay on their bunks, listening intently, torn between a profound sense of relief and a gnawing shame. They had marched into battle, sacrificing everything to expand a vast Reich. Yet here they were, fed and guarded by men who seemed more like figures of myth than actual military personnel. The cowboy was no mere invention. He was flesh, dust, and leather, and he lived with a freedom on the edge of that fence that they had never truly known in the grand armies of Europe. Night descended with the characteristic swiftness of the desert. The western horizon glowed with the last fading embers of sunlight, and the prisoners watched this silent spectacle through the narrow cracks in their barracks walls. The same cowboy stood by a lantern now, its soft glow tracing the distinctive line of his hat. The mournful notes of a harmonica drifted from somewhere beyond the wire, playing a tune the Germans did not know but felt resonate deep in their bones. For the very first time since their capture, the pervasive silence was not filled with despair, but with a strange, unsettling confusion. The day had begun with an absolute certainty. Captivity unequivocally meant degradation. Yet by its close, an unsettling uncertainty reigned. Was this land of cattle, coffee, and cowboys truly their prison? Or was it, in some mocking twist of fate, a fleeting glimpse of a freedom they had never truly known at home? And as one prisoner scribbled in his diary that night by the dim light of a contraband candle, he left behind words that would echo long after the war had ended. "I fear less the barbed wire than the horizon beyond it. For the first time, I wonder if we are the ones who have been fenced in all along." The first morning in camp began with a sharp, piercing whistle that cut through the soft, natural hum of the prairie and jolted the Germans abruptly awake. They rose stiffly from their bunks, anticipating meager rations of watery soup or hard, stale bread, the kind of punishment rations whispered about during their voyage. Yet, when they shuffled into the mess hall, the scene before them was startling. Long wooden tables were laden with steaming bowls of beef stew, generous slices of cornbread stacked high on tin trays, and pitchers of hot, black coffee whose rich, bitter perfume filled the entire room. This was certainly not luxury by American standards, but to men who had marched on empty stomachs through North Africa or survived on meager ersatz bread in Europe, it was an astonishing excess. Some hesitated, unsure if it was a cleverly disguised trap. A guard, his hat tipped casually back, urged them forward with a simple, reassuring gesture. "Eat," he said, as if it required no further explanation. One prisoner tentatively lifted his spoon, sipped the broth, and closed his eyes. The beef practically melted on his tongue. Another bit into the cornbread and laughed softly, almost to himself. It was sweet, far softer than any bread he had ever known back home. He whispered, almost ashamed, "My family has not seen white flour in years." The others nodded in solemn agreement, chewing in silence. Every mouthful was a poignant reminder that their loved ones back in Germany were enduring profound hunger while they, the captured enemy, ate like men on holiday. Words of this abundance spread quickly. Letters home, carefully censored but still full of telling clues, hinted at the incredible plenty. A camp report from 1944 recorded one prisoner writing, "Mother, do not worry for me. I eat here more meat than I did as a boy." Another noted the endless supply of coffee, a drink reserved in Germany for the truly wealthy, now poured freely into chipped mugs without the need for precious ration tickets. Some guards chuckled good-naturedly at the prisoners' astonishment, muttering that the menu wasn't even particularly special. It was simply what any American farmhand might eat on an ordinary day. The barbed wire still loomed outside, a constant physical barrier, but inside the camp, the comforting rhythms of ranch life began to subtly seep in. After breakfast, prisoners were marched out not for punitive drills, but for various work details: harvesting cotton, repairing fences, tending fields, or unloading heavy hay bales on local ranches. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, they could be assigned non-military labor. And in these agricultural states, their presence was desperately needed. With so many American men serving overseas, the farms faced a severe shortage of labor. Now, the enemy carried buckets of water, hauled heavy grain sacks, and guided plows behind horses. At first, there was grumbling. Many POWs considered farm labor beneath their status as soldiers. Some tried to resist, perhaps hoping for a conflict that would finally prove the cruelty of their captors. Yet the guards rarely raised their voices. They pointed, demonstrated, and sometimes even joined in the physical labor. One cowboy, sweat visibly dripping from beneath his hat, patiently showed a young German how to properly lift a hay bale without breaking his back. The prisoner, initially embarrassed, awkwardly imitated him. Later, in the barracks, he admitted he had never before witnessed a man of authority helping rather than merely ordering. Pay was another profound shock. Each man received credits, approximately 80 cents a day, for his labor. They could spend this in the camp canteen on toiletries, stationery, or even small luxuries like chocolate or cigarettes. For men who had been indoctrinated to believe they would be starved, this simple financial transaction felt utterly surreal. A German corporal once joked bitterly, "I fought for Hitler and earned nothing. I picked cotton for a cowboy and I am paid." Cultural exchanges multiplied rapidly. On Sundays, local farmers who had hired POWs sometimes offered them lemonade, homemade biscuits, or even a comfortable chair on the porch. One elderly Texan recalled decades later that a young German helped him fix a fence, then sat quietly on the steps, staring out at the vast, open land. When asked what he was thinking, the prisoner said, "I never saw a country so big it does not end." His voice carried an unmistakable awe, not resentment. But this abundance brought with it a new kind of internal conflict. Within the barracks, some men grew increasingly uneasy. They feared they were growing soft, seduced by the food and fairness, slowly losing their loyalty to the Reich. Others whispered that the Americans had no right to treat them so well, that it was a humiliation far worse than any physical beatings. A stubborn few clung fiercely to Nazi ideology, sneering contemptuously at their fellow prisoners who laughed during work or savored their American meals. Tension brewed, deeply dividing men between those who desperately clung to old pride and those who began to question what true strength actually meant. In official reports, American officers noted these growing divisions. Some camps even segregated hardliners, fearing they would intimidate or unduly influence the others. But in everyday life, the lines often blurred. A man could march into captivity, loudly declaring himself superior, and a week later find himself humming cowboy songs he had overheard from guards, tapping his foot rhythmically as he washed down cornbread with yet another mug of coffee. The sensory details of this new life etched themselves deeply into memory. The soft creak of saddle leather as guards rode along the fences, the inviting hiss of cornbread batter on a hot skillet, the fresh, earthy smell of cut hay drifting through open barracks windows. These were things that belonged not to prisoners but to free men. Yet here the Germans lived among them, experiencing America not as conquerors or tourists, but as unwilling guests who nonetheless found themselves profoundly changed. One prisoner later confessed in a memoir, "We feared beatings, but none came. Instead, they gave us bread so white it shamed us. They poured coffee until we were sick of it. They paid us to work their land. In their generosity, I found not comfort, but confusion." His words captured the very heart of the conflict. How could an enemy show such kindness when his own leaders demanded only cruelty? Yet even in this profound paradox, humor subtly seeped through. A Texas guard recalled teaching a German lieutenant how to rope a calf during downtime. The officer tried, missed repeatedly, tried again, and ultimately ended up tangled hilariously in his own lasso while the Americans roared with laughter. The guard later quipped, "That was the only German officer I saw surrender twice in one day." For the prisoners, laughter became both a source of shame and a welcome release, a dawning recognition that the world they had been taught to despise was not only stronger, but profoundly freer in spirit. By autumn, the camp's rhythms felt almost routine. Work, meals, letters home, the occasional baseball game watched through fences. But beneath this surface, the shock of abundance still gnawed. They ate succulent beef while their families survived on meager potatoes. They drank endless coffee while mothers and wives stood for hours in ration lines. Each spoonful of food was both a gifted sustenance and a fresh wound. One evening, after a long day of hauling hay, a group of Germans lingered by the fence as the sun dipped majestically over the vast plains. Beyond the wire, a cowboy lit a lantern, its warm glow illuminating his weathered, sun-beaten face. He tipped his hat in a simple gesture and walked away, leaving behind only the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant, mournful lowing of cattle. One prisoner whispered, "He works harder than we do, yet he is free. Why do they treat us better than our own leaders?" The question hung heavy and unresolved in the warm night air. The men returned to their barracks, silent and deeply unsettled. They were full of bread and beef, yet empty of answers. And as the lights went out, more than one wondered whether the true captivity lay inside the fence, or perhaps within the very chains of belief they had carried with them from home. The days lengthened, marked not by monotonous repetition, but by strange and unexpected discoveries. Within the confines of the barbed wire, life began to take on rhythms that felt almost civilized, unnervingly so. The Germans had expected to lose themselves in unrelenting punishment, yet they found opportunities they had not even known in their own homeland. The barracks, initially smelling only of hay and soap, soon echoed with the scratch of pencils, the gentle shuffle of books, and the quiet murmur of lessons. America, it turned out, was willing to educate its captives. Classes quickly sprang up in the dusty camp halls. English lessons were led by local schoolteachers, woodworking was taught by farmers who also served as guards, and even lectures in mathematics and history were delivered by the prisoners themselves. Some men hunched diligently over desks, sounding out halting English phrases. Others hammered together crude chairs or carved small, intricate figures from pine, the sweet scent of wood shavings clinging to their clothes. At night, the barracks glowed faintly with lantern light as men painstakingly copied vocabulary words into notebooks, whispering, "Hello, coffee, cowboy," trying the unfamiliar syllables on their tongues. It was a freedom they had not anticipated. Inside the fence, their world expanded in unexpected ways. One prisoner later wrote, "I learned more in 1 year of captivity than in all the years of Hitler's speeches." The irony was truly sharp. Behind barbed wire, under the watchful eye of supposed enemies, they found the vital space to truly think. Music also bled through the nights. Germans who had carried harmonicas tucked carefully in their kit began to play. First, the sad, evocative folk tunes of their homeland, then daringly, the American cowboy songs they had overheard. Soon, makeshift camp bands formed. Violins strummed plaintively, accordions wheezed their melodies, and the rustic rhythms of ranch life wove themselves seamlessly into the melancholic melodies of the defeated. Guards sometimes paused to listen, tipping their hats in quiet acknowledgement before continuing their patrols. For the prisoners, it was unsettling how easily they could mimic the sounds of a culture they had been so thoroughly taught to despise. The contradictions deepened with every passing week. Camp newspapers appeared, printed on mimeograph machines, filled with essays, jokes, and even candid editorials. Some issues carried spirited debates over politics. Others offered heartfelt poetry written in cramped German script. By 1945, more than 400 such camp newspapers circulated across the United States, each one a unique voice of men who, even as captives, steadfastly refused silence. In one camp, an editorial boldly asked, "Why do we speak of superiority when the cowboy feeds us and we cannot feed ourselves?" Such words might have been considered treasonous back home. Here, they were merely scribbled in ink and pinned to a bulletin board. Beyond the wire, the demanding work continued. Prisoners cut wheat under the wide, endless Nebraska sky, plucked cotton in the sweltering Oklahoma heat, and branded cattle under the watchful, unblinking gaze of ranchers who readily offered them water when the sun grew too cruel. The distinct smell of scorched leather, the sharp hiss of branding irons, the constant dust in their mouths. It all became an intrinsic part of their daily lives. Some grew genuinely proud of their labor, holding up their calloused hands as tangible proof that they were not merely prisoners, but men still capable of meaningful usefulness. One guard recalled a moment that etched itself into his memory. A German soldier, young and thin, wiped sweat from his brow after meticulously stacking bales of hay. The rancher whose land he worked extended a hand and said simply, "Good job." The prisoner froze. In Germany, no farmer would ever thank a soldier. Authority demanded unquestioning obedience, not gratitude. Yet here was a cowboy, dusty and sunburned, treating him as an equal in labor. The young man shook the hand awkwardly at first, then with a firm, confident grip. Later that night, he confessed to a bunkmate that the handshake had shaken him more profoundly than any defeat on the battlefield. But not all embraced this new rhythm. Some hardened themselves, sneering contemptuously at the softness of comrades who smiled at guards or diligently studied English words. They called them traitors, men seduced by the enemy's comfort. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. In certain camps, die-hard loyalists tried to control the barracks, bullying others into silence, constantly reminding them of their sacred oath to Hitler. American officials noticed these dynamics. Reports described the urgent need to separate hardcore Nazis from those who merely wished to survive. The barbed wire contained not just prisoners, but their deep-seated conflicts, old allegiances fiercely battling new impressions. Still, the pervasive cowboy presence loomed large, an unspoken reminder of an entirely different way to live. The prisoners watched their guards play cards under the soft lantern light, laugh freely, spit tobacco into the dirt, and ride horses with casual, effortless mastery. Authority here was not barked in commands, but carried subtly in the tilt of a hat, the slow, deliberate draw of a word. To the Germans, raised under the shadow of rigid order, this was utterly baffling. How could discipline truly exist without terror? How could men command genuine respect without ever raising their voices? One night, a prisoner recorded a poignant moment in his diary. He had been walking near the fence after work, watching a cowboy lead his horse into the stable. The guard hummed softly as he worked, pausing to gently stroke the animal's neck, speaking quietly to it. The German wrote, "I saw more kindness in his hand on that horse than I saw in 1,000 salutes to my officers." It was a revelation, authority born not of fear, but of care. Humor, too, often bridged the cultural gap. In one camp, prisoners played soccer inside the fence while guards cheered good-naturedly from the outside. A ball sailed too far, and a cowboy skillfully kicked it back with surprising agility. The Germans laughed, shouting mock applause. The guard tipped his hat, grinning broadly. It was absurd. Enemies sharing a game, the barbed wire the only physical barrier between them. Yet in that very absurdity lay a truth the Germans could not ignore. Humanity seeped through even the harshest of boundaries. And so the internal conflict sharpened. Was this kindness a deceptive mask, or was it truly genuine? Could men raised to believe in brutality accept dignity from those they called enemies? Every meal, every handshake, every note of music pressed the question deeper into their souls. Some responded with fierce defiance, clinging desperately to old pride. Others silently began to wonder if they had been wrong all along. The camp's routines might have seemed ordinary to outsiders: work, meals, rest. Yet for the prisoners, each day slowly chipped away at long-held certainties. Barbed wire kept them physically enclosed, but inside that fence, ideas moved freely. They debated, they studied, they played, and slowly, a different, unsettling vision of freedom began to creep into their very bones. As winter settled over the plains, the nights grew long and bitterly cold. The prisoners huddled together in their bunks, blankets pulled tightly, their breath clouding visibly in the frigid air. Outside, the lanterns burned steadily, and the cowboys paced slowly, their spurs clicking softly on the frozen ground. Through the thin walls, the Germans could faintly hear the strains of a harmonica, a lonely tune drifting across the camp. Some closed their eyes and let the music carry them away. Others lay awake, profoundly unsettled, realizing that captivity had unexpectedly given them a taste of something far more dangerous than cruelty, an idea of freedom that could never be unlearned. And in the silence just before sleep, one whispered question passed from bunk to bunk, a question no one dared to answer aloud. If this is how America treats its prisoners, then how much freer must its people be? The war ended not with a roar in the camps, but with a quiet, persistent whisper. Rumors began to move through the barracks in the spring of 1945. Germany had surrendered. The Reich had fallen. Hitler was dead. The men sat stunned on their bunks, staring blankly at their boots, their hands, the rough floorboards beneath them. Some wept quietly, tears streaming down their faces. Others clenched their fists tightly, utterly unable to imagine a world without the regime that had so completely defined their lives. But outside the wire, the cowboys moved as they always had, feeding cattle, sipping their coffee, adjusting saddles before dawn. For the prisoners, the profound collapse of their homeland contrasted painfully with the steady, enduring rhythm of the ranch life surrounding them. The Reich had promised permanence and delivered only ruin. The cowboy never promised anything, yet he endured. Repatriation began slowly. Trains lined up once more, ready to carry the defeated back across the vast Atlantic. Many prisoners felt an overwhelming sense of relief at the prospect of finally going home. But there was also a knowing sorrow, a deep unease they could not quite name. They had arrived in America with absolute certainty that it was cruel, that it was decadent, that it was utterly inferior to the strength of the Reich. They now left with their arms full of contradictions, their stomachs full of cornbread, their ears full of cowboy songs, and their hearts carrying poignant memories of a freedom they had never known before the war. Letters preserved from those final weeks reveal this profound dissonance. One soldier wrote to his mother, "I come back to you changed. The Americans did not beat me. They shook my hand. They did not starve me. They gave me bread until I was ashamed to eat it. They did not humiliate me. They let me work. They paid me. They treated me as if I were still a man." Another specifically described the Cowboys. "They live harder than we do, but freer. Their discipline comes not from fear, but from respect. I think of them often. It was in those small, seemingly insignificant moments that the transformation deepened. A firm handshake after a long day of haying. A juicy slice of watermelon shared casually in the oppressive heat of August. A harmonica tune drifting across the fence, carried softly on the prairie wind. For some, it was the distinctive sound of boots on a wooden porch, spurs ringing faintly like distant bells. For others, it was the simple sight of a cowboy tipping his hat without a trace of arrogance, a gesture of courtesy so humble it lodged in memory like an enduring splinter. The Americans had not intended to change them. The cowboy was not a missionary, nor a propagandist. He simply existed. His presence, his quiet ease, his inherent dignity were enough. The prisoners began to tell themselves stories about him, half in jest, half in reverence. They said he feared no officer because he bowed to none. They said his land was so wide he could never truly be cornered. They said his strength was not in muscle alone, but in the calm, assured way he faced the horizon, as though nothing could ever break him. These were not official lessons, not regulations written down in Geneva. They were profound impressions absorbed quietly, impressions that slowly reshaped how the Germans saw both America and themselves. When they returned to Europe, many carried these impressions like cherished contraband. Post-war Germany was a land of rubble, ration cards, and biting cold winters. Yet in their minds, there were still vivid fields of wheat under the golden Nebraska sun. Still the bitter, familiar smell of endless coffee in tin mugs. Still the powerful sight of men who worked hard without cruelty. Some even sought to recreate fragments of that life. Cowboy clubs sprang up in West Germany during the 1950s, where men donned hats, strummed guitars, and dreamed of the vast plains they had once seen through barbed wire. A few even named their farms with English words, quietly paying tribute to the land that had once held them prisoner but had, paradoxically, given them dignity. Historians who have meticulously studied their letters and memoirs agree. The encounter with cowboys left a mark far deeper than most realized at the time. It was not that every German abandoned old ideologies or instantly embraced American democracy. But seeds were planted, seeds of doubt about the myths they had been fed, seeds of admiration for a way of life that seemed both utterly foreign and profoundly enviable. As one former POW admitted decades later, "I went to America an enemy. I left not a friend perhaps, but with respect. The cowboy taught me more about freedom than any general." The Americans themselves often downplayed the significance of this. For them, it was simply the right thing to do. Follow the Geneva Convention, feed the men, let them work, keep the peace. But perhaps unknowingly, they demonstrated something far more profound, that power need not crush, that strength could be quiet, that freedom could be embodied in the everyday life of a rancher who tipped his hat and carried his tools. Yet for the prisoners, this generosity brought not only gratitude, but also a deep sense of shame. They knew their families had suffered under relentless bombing, starvation, and pervasive fear while they had eaten beef stew and played soccer behind fences. This guilt lingered, pressing heavily on their consciences. Some confessed they dreaded returning home, feared admitting how well they had lived in the enemy's hands. One man said bluntly, "We lived better in captivity than our people did in freedom." What does that say of us? The question could not be easily answered. It haunted them as they boarded the trains once more, as the iron wheels carried them east, as the land of cowboys receded behind them. At the docks, they looked back toward the horizon where they had first arrived years earlier. Some carried books they had studied diligently in camp. Others carried small carvings of horses, gifts meticulously crafted from scraps of wood. Many carried only memories, but all of them carried the fundamental question of what freedom truly meant, and why they had only tasted it in defeat. The trains rolled on. Through the windows, the prisoners watched the American countryside pass one last time. Fields golden with harvest, cattle grazing lazily, small towns with white church steeples. A boy waved innocently at the train, utterly unaware that the men inside were the very enemy his father had fought. A cowboy on horseback appeared briefly, silhouetted against the vast sky, then vanished just as quickly into the dust. The prisoners pressed their faces against the glass as though trying to fix the image forever in their minds. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, many still spoke of that indelible image. Not of the battlefields of North Africa or the desolate ruins of Berlin, but of a cowboy leaning casually on a fence, spurs shining brilliantly in the sun. The memory carried both comfort and disquiet, a constant reminder that their war had ended not in brutal clashes, but in a quiet, unexpected lesson they had never anticipated. And so the story lingers, not in dry statistics or formal treaties, but in the profound paradox of men who discovered freedom while trapped, who met America not through grand speeches or slick propaganda, but through the dust, sweat, and calm dignity of cowboys. It is a story of enemies disarmed not by bullets, but by bread, by coffee, by handshakes offered across the immense gulf of war. The trains disappeared into the east, but the memory remained, carried deep in the hearts of men who had once believed themselves destined to rule the world. They had met their captors in boots and hats, and they could not forget them. And in that unforgettable image lay a final, lingering question. If the cowboy was real, then what else about America was true?